I'd like to begin by thanking the Clark Art Institute, Olivier Meslay, Director of the Clark, and Caro Fowler, Director of Research and Academic Programs, as well as the librarians and staff and my fellow fellows who have helped to make this an extraordinarily productive and fulfilling semester, despite all the challenges that this year has brought. My research at the Clark has focused on early modern Venice, and what I'm presenting today is part of a larger project that examines the mobility and segregation of women in relation to the urban environment and its spatial networks. In contrast with the idealized and largely depopulated image represented in Jacopo de Barbari's view of Venice from 1500, I consider the messy vitality of particular neighborhoods and parishes where local conditions and social relations offer insights about the modes women used to exercise agency. Building on a steadily growing body of research from social, literary, and art historians over the last few decades, this work is rooted in archival resources that illuminate how women of varied social economic standing presented gendered identity, raised children and otherwise worked, managed financial and legal matters within and beyond the household, performed their religious faith, perpetrated and were victims of crime, and paid legal consequences or sought justice through civic offices. Naturally, a range of factors conditioned just how different women carried out these activities. Upper-class women may have had access to greater financial means, more direct access to power, and therefore possibly more influence than those of lower station. They also may have participated in a broad range of social networks that extended beyond their neighborhood or district. But their status also brought expectations of restricted physical mobility. For Venice's elite men, preserving honor and reputation ideally meant relegating wives and kinswomen to the enclosed spaces of home or convent, limiting their activities in the public realm to prescribed settings, occasions, and company in order to contain the potential threats represented by women's sexuality. But their stratum represented only about 10 to 15% of the Venetian populace. My recent research centers on women who deviated from normative gender roles by engaging in the heterosexual sex trade, whose marginalized status presented both obstacles to and opportunities for exercising agency. In early modern Italy, the category today referred to as a sex worker included a spectrum of profiles, which Guido Ruggiero has referred to as a social hierarchy of prostitution. My study considers the full range of these identities. At the bottom, we find the meretrice, the name originating in the Latin meretrix, she who earns. These women personally solicited clients or collaborated with a procurer, living and working in rented rooms or in a municipal brothel, sometimes taking on the role as a temporary solution to precarious personal circumstances. At the top, courtisane, courtesans, enjoyed greater financial resources and more comfortable and visually rich accommodation. Generally assumed to be supported by one or more exclusive upper-class patron clients, other than informal, discreet, or individual transactions, courtesans entertained not just in the bedroom, but also in the salon or at the dining or gaming table, where they demonstrated their wit and cultivation. The prints I'm showing here, instructively or if reductively, used dress to classify what Bronwyn Wilson has referred to as the social and moral types of Venetian women, including sex workers. To contemporary Venetians, the courtesan's dress easily differentiated her from the lower class meretrice, but made her virtually indistinguishable from women in the higher ranks of Venice's socioeconomic strata, a matter of concern addressed by sumptuary laws that ultimately proved ineffective. Despite these practical differences, the functional definition used by civic authorities collapsed such distinctions, identifying anyone who exchanged sex for compensation, whether money, gifts, or favors, as a base meretrice. As this map shows, sex workers are documented in almost every parish in the city. Their numbers were considerable. Legislators lamented the infinite number of them that could be found on the streets and in the principal places of the city, setting a bad example for everyone. However, despite laws requiring sex workers to register with neighborhood authorities and parish censuses intended to make a record of every soul in the city, no known definitive count exists. Still, based on the data that do survive, it's safe to say that at least a few thousand women offered sex for compensation at any given time. And this number doesn't even begin to capture those who played supporting roles in the trade. The procurers, servants, gondoliers, lodging house matrons, bathhouse attendants, gambling parlor hosts, tavern workers, sellers and renters of secondhand furnishings and clothing, porters, lantern carriers, and others who comprise the sex workers' commercial network. Their narratives emerge from a combination of archival sources, including legislation, judicial and magisterial records, census documents and tax declarations, and popular texts like travel accounts, broadsheets, and satires. These sources are idiosyncratic in scope and fragmented in terms of the time periods they document. They almost never record the sex worker's first-person voice, and they make it extremely difficult to assess the strength of the ties between those mostly anonymous individuals. And yet, when taken together and subjected to questions focused on the built environment and urban experiences, these sources reveal patterns of place-based practices and yield an understanding of the ways in which sex workers tactically deployed the city's spatial networks for their own purposes, integrating the sex trade into the city's everyday life. These experiences and networks can be rendered legible through mapping, which plays a fundamental role in this project as a heuristic tool of analysis and as a tool of representation and argumentation. Michel de Certeau's notion of space as practiced place provides a useful framework for interrogating the map's capacity to reveal human and spatial networks. Fixed sites or places include buildings like homes, brothels, inns, lodging houses, and bathhouses, but also exposed locations like streets, canals, quays, bridges, squares, porticos, and piers, locations typically plotted on urban maps. But place is not neutral. Its physical attributes, scale, material, built-in natural site conditions, density of surroundings, exposure to light, and connectedness, among others, inflect the ways in which place supports and accommodates particular practices. The images I'm showing here convey something of how the physical qualities of Venetian streets might influence spatial practices, where parallax, rather than perspective, usually guides the experience. In the narrow and dark alleys, light ultimately indicates the path ahead rather than some monument destination in the distance. This could be the case when traveling by boat, too, since only a few canals provided long and open vistas. Whether enclosed by the sheer face of buildings or bordered by a pedestrian quay, the boat's low position on the water uniquely shaped the acts of moving, seeing, and being seen. In contrast to the fixed place, space is the product of mobile elements, most notably bodies, whether circulating on foot or by boat, orienting, situating, and temporalizing the fixed place. For example, the public nature of solicitation exposed and reinforced the relationship between sex work and place by directly and repeatedly contributing to durable perceptions that accrued at particular sites, at particular times of day, over various durations, apprehended even by casual passers-by who never partook in the trade themselves. The rhythms of and encounters of such interactions comprise what Certeau calls a polyvalent unity. This polyvalent unity emerges in maps that connect the fixed and the mobile by juxtaposing and layering information gleaned from early modern sources with the urban elements of place. Although the map has certain obvious limitations stemming from its static two-dimensional nature, it can nevertheless document the locations and timescales associated with ephemeral actions, as well as paths of circulation, thereby representing Venice as dynamic space rather than static place. The city of Venice saw transactional sex as a necessary evil, and as such, the trade was morally condemned, but officially tolerated. In 1360, the government attempted to segregate sex work by establishing a municipal brothel in the area known as Rialto. A century later, that brothel was superseded by a different one, a three-story building sited closer to the Grand Canal, a location that provided more convenient access than the first. The establishment and longevity of the brothel serves as an indicator of attitudes towards sex work in Venice. When sex workers were cited by magistrates, it was usually not for prostitution per se, unless it was a case of being caught in flagrante delicto. Rather, it was because they lived and worked outside the brothel, because they caused some kind of public disturbance or scandal, or because they were violating sumptuary laws. The Rialto sites had multiple advantages, the obvious one being the area's status as the city's main commercial zone, and with a built-in source of clientele. Another was its simultaneous combination of centrality and remove from Piazza San Marco, home to the Doge's residence, seat of government administration, and the shrine that held the remains of the city's patron saint, which authorities were keen to protect from the taint of the trade. This map shows that Rialto's suitability as a brothel also stemmed from its status as the city's principal circulation node. Not only did it have the advantage of adjacency to the only bridge crossing the Grand Canal at the time, but its long quays drew significant boat traffic. Guild statutes and 17th century maps show that most gondolas that landed here traveled within the city, but several provided access to points outside, islands around the lagoon or cities on the terra firma, delivering so-called foreign clientele that, at least in theory, was the brothel's target market. Michel Foucault's concept of heterotopia helps us understand brothels as strategic mechanisms that established a certain alterity for their inhabitants. But I argue that there was an instability to this otherness, owing in part to the extension of the sex trade from the brothel sites throughout Rialto Island and beyond. Relying on legislation that aimed to limit sex workers' mobility, Paula Clark and others have suggested that the brothels merely functioned as nodes within a district of sex trade at Rialto. The extent to which this was the case is revealed and confirmed in the 1514 tax declaration submitted by Dionisio Malpiero, who inherited the later brothel building from his father. He complained that the nearby inns, some of which incidentally had already been cited in connection with sex work for at least a century, all rented to meretrici who then failed to pay him the monthly fee required of those who lived and worked outside the brothel. His son, Priamo, stated in 1537 that the business was still failing. But instead of blaming the situation on competition from neighboring inns, he signaled that the trade was moving away from Rialto altogether. Only 10 tenants lived at the brothel, he said, and the 34 volte, or stalls, that he rented out nearby were mostly empty. Sometimes there are 10 or 15 of them, he says. Sometimes only 3 or 4. Sometimes they stay for a day, sometimes for an hour. Many of them take off without paying. The reason for this downturn in business, he said, was that sex workers were living and working all over the city. It's on these independent women that I'm focusing, sex workers who resisted the restrictions of the brothel and instead resided, solicited, and worked in other locations around Venice. A significant cohort lived in the parishes surrounding Rialto, but concentrations could also be found elsewhere in the city. And my larger project will be organized around case studies of these zones. Today, I'll focus on just a couple of these zones, and I'm going to offer some insights about how the social, commercial, and built conditions at the local neighborhood scale informed the everyday spatial practices of these sex workers. To explain the distribution of sex work throughout the city, the presumed reasons for rejecting the brothel need to be considered. Many women entered this line of work as a last resort in the absence of other forms of support. They saw sex as an economic resource that was more lucrative than other trades open to women. Rejecting the brothel allowed them to seek out alternative and more diverse markets and collaborators. These women were more likely to exercise control over their income than those who lived and worked at the brothel, where the matron was known to keep her charges indebted and therefore bound to the trade and the brothel. And census documents identify many of these women as heads of households that included parents, siblings, children, a husband or a domestic partner, and sometimes even servants. Some made extra money by renting to lodgers or sharing housing with other sex workers. So independence from the brothel allowed them to be flexible and entrepreneurial. Based on my research and mapping, I argue that sex workers were attracted to particular locations for 4 principal factors. One was low property values, which are revealed in the tax declarations of building owners. Although Venice was known for the mixing of socioeconomic classes, sex workers gravitated to areas with a concentration of poor housing stock, sometimes rented by the early modern equivalent of slumlords, who, like the brothel owners, held on to their properties for generations. Although I've found convincing evidence that this is the case, my data are as yet too diffuse to correlate with my other sources or to map in a methodical way. But there are 3 other factors at play here. One is that sex workers seem to have sought integration into existing cohorts of other meretrici. When the trade became established in and associated with known locations, clients could more easily seek it out, producing a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy in which sex workers converged where they might have both collaborated and competed with one another. They also appear to have sought proximity to complementary businesses of the sort that had initially made Rialto a productive site for the brothel. So these included gondola landings and inns, but also lodging houses, bathhouses, gambling parlors, and taverns. And then finally, within their neighborhoods, a consideration that drew these women to particular locations for solicitation was access to advantageous circulation routes and infrastructure, urban spaces that supported the need to be both visible and invisible, able to see clients and to be seen by them, while also being able to elude authorities or others who might disrupt their activities. As I'll show today, these conditions include intersections of streets and canals, especially bridges, whose status as both connectors and inflection points within the urban fabric naturally attracted sex workers, but also beggars and itinerant retailers. And I'm also looking at porticos designed both for through traffic and for temporary shelter, making them ideal sites of solicitation and trysts, but also gambling, theft, assault, and other activities that authorities were keen to discourage, so much so that many porticos in the city were demolished in the 15th century. While such junctions and spatial networks obviously existed throughout Venice, as I'll show, some had advantages over others. Among the areas consistently identified with sex work is the parish of Santa Maria Formosa and its neighboring parishes, Santa Marina and San Giovanni Novo, which show how and why multiple actors converged in a zone with where the diverse needs of the trade network could be met. This area owes its status as a hub for the trade, at least in part, to its proximity to a site whose importance to the city rivaled Rialto, Piazza San Marco. The piazza was officially off limits to sex workers since at least 1444, but the many inns around its perimeter and in the streets surrounding it became notorious for welcoming meretrici, and therefore offending the good and ancient customs associated with the square and its institutions. But of course, urban spaces are polyvalent, and San Marco was not only a center of political and religious activity. As this woodcut print by Joost Amman shows, despite the desire for decorum, and especially before Jacopo Sansovino's projects regularized and formalized the square in the mid-16th century, the piazza and the activities associated with it were emblematic of Venice's complexity and diversity. Authorities regularly organized sweeps of these nearby inns, but it seems to have been a losing battle. Another site advantage for sex workers in these parishes around Santa Maria Formosa was access to the Riva degli Schiavoni, and the Riva is just to the right, out of the view of this detail to the right of the piazzetta, the small piazza in front of the Palazzo Ducale. So this quay was a very wide space where gondolas docked from Istria and Dalmatia, and also larger ships docked there. And they were manned by scores of sailors and delivered large numbers of passengers, many who sought diversion and perhaps received information on the whereabouts of Venice's sex workers from the porters who worked there. But Santa Maria Formosa and its neighbor parishes also had internal dynamics that supported the trade. Two streets there, Calle Longa and Ruga Giuffa, appear repeatedly in documents of various sorts. These include an order issued in 1502 that identified key sites where sex workers were to be rounded up and moved to Rialto, summary justice records from the mid-16th century, parish censuses from the 1580s and 90s, and a source that billed itself as a catalog which identified over 200 of the city's courtesans, where they and their procurers could be found, and the price they charged. Some of these documents identify places of residence for sex workers, procurers, and individuals involved in related businesses, and those implicated in petty crime. Other documents name places of solicitation. These two kinds of sites of residence and solicitation produced and accommodated different spatial practices involving different actors and different time scales. While the work I'm presenting today does not explicitly address these distinctions, my ongoing mapping project does, and promises to add nuance to our understanding of the shifting boundaries between public and private realms in the early modern city. But a survey of local conditions does begin to suggest how these distinctions might have been negotiated. So Calle Longa and Ruga Giuffa show how certain arteries organized activities associated with the sex trade within the neighborhood. Both were important segments within extended circulation networks. Calle Lunga connected to the city's northern edges and the lagoon beyond, and also south towards San Marco. Rugajufa was also an important segment in a path that extended through the square of Santa Maria Formosa on toward Rialto. And it also formed part of a network leading to San Marco. In the rabbit warren of Venetian alleys, these two long arteries allowed for convenient and uninterrupted movement of a sort seldom seen in the city. The two streets also offered many points of access to documented sites of sex work in narrow alleys that dead end at small courtyards or canals. Their connections to bridges also allowed them to intercept traffic from adjacent islands, a subject I'll return to shortly. The parish censuses and summary justice records provide a portrait of a dense working-class neighborhood where petty and sometimes violent crime regularly occurred, and they show the ways in which commercial relationships could become personal in the domestic realm. The area is second only to the parish of San Moise on the opposite side of Piazza San Marco to the west, in the number of sex workers named in the judicial magistracy's files, sometimes as perpetrators, but mostly as victims. Of the 19 criminal cases cited in Santa Maria Formosa, most of the named sex workers lived on or just off Calle Lunga and Rugajufa, and most suffered at the hands of men from the parish. A noteworthy example is the case of the Greek Marietta, who had a violent run-in with one Taddeo from Crema, both from Santa Maria Formosa parish. The record notes not only that Taddeo illegally carried a weapon, but also that, in addition to being banned from Venice and its territories for 3 years, he was required to pay the fees for Marietta's doctor and medicine, presumably from injuries caused by their encounter. Some women were victimized repeatedly, and their perpetrators were sometimes repeat offenders, as can be seen through the case of the sex worker Camilla Stella, a victim of Alexandro, a bread baker in the parish. 3 days later, Camilla Stella was the victim of another man, Marinello, ironically enough identified as a maestro del giustizia, who himself went on a few days later to have a conflict with 2 other sex workers elsewhere in the city. Closer to home, the male companions of sex workers appear frequently in the judicial magistracy's records, identified with the notorious women with whom they lived, much the same way a woman's name would identify her with her father or her husband. An example is Piero, a sailor who was the man of the sex worker Pasqua, who lived in the Corte Nuova in Santa Maria Formosa, cited for a crime committed with a weapon. These cases also name men who were lodgers rather than partners, like Cirignol, who lived in the house of Bella, a sex worker in Calle Lunga. He used a weapon against a man who lodged with another meretrice in the neighboring parish. Were such perpetrators protecting the woman with whom they lived from competitor procurers and sex workers, or from threatening clients or harassers? The records do not explain their motives or how they came to be part of the households of sex workers, but they do shed light on the personal connections and encounters within and across the neighborhood. Just as meretrici in Rialto benefited from nearby commercial and leisure activities, those in the Santa Maria Formosa area likely profited from the clientele provided by 2 well-known inns in the neighborhood, the Serpe, which was located on the Riva, and the Corona, located within the heart of the parish. Both had been approved in 1467 to house sex workers. The area's many lodging houses also contributed to the trade, since they were places where a steady and growing stream of non-Venetians took up temporary residence alongside countrymen who came and settled in this zone. As Rosa Salzberg has shown, this area was home to the highest concentration of lodging houses in the city. The link between sex work and the hospitality sector, addressed through legislation as early as the 15th century, can be seen on the street where the Corona was located. The sex worker Barbara Schiavone lived next door to a family of 4 who lodged 5 Greek merchants. And just across the canal, we find 6 sex workers distributed between 3 neighboring residences. In a nearby courtyard, 2 different women took in lodgers, including some from Greece, some from Germany, and others from cities on the terra firma. And another asset to the sex workers in this zone was the bathhouse, which was the best known of the many such establishments in the city. This image, or these images, show the canal side quay and portico that take their name from the bathhouse. Census documents show that the Stufaiolo who ran it lived on the square just adjacent, near the church. Sources report that the bathhouse was composed of 2 connected rooms. The first where the attendants clipped nails, trimmed calluses, exfoliated skin, performed bloodletting, and applied ointments and poultices. And the second room, which housed the baths, where braziers were probably used to create steam. We're told that it was furnished with many stools, cushions, and carpets. The tubs were made of blonde wood, and the linens were white. A place of comfort and perhaps even luxury. But bathhouses had come to be associated with sex work, as multiple attempts to penalize the merging of the two attest, and the San Giovanni Novo stufa was no exception. An account from 1597 reports that Bettina Zanetti, a courtesan from the neighborhood, was accosted there by the patrician Antonio Molin. When the proprietor and his nephew tried to stop Molin, they ended up killing him, and they were both condemned to death. Following this scandal, the bathhouse changed hands and stayed in business into the 17th century, when the place is said to have welcomed courtesans in the morning so as not to scandalize the canons of San Marco and San Basso, who regularly came in the evening after Vespers. These examples show how the sex trade both permeated and connected the parish. Another area that provides abundant information about ways that sex work integrated into neighborhood life in similar but also particular ways can be found in the northwestern district of Kanarejo. Connected to but relatively distant from Venice's institutional centers, the area's oblong parallel islands organize traffic into the heart of the district, and 2 major north-south canals funneled traffic toward the Grand Canal. Quays on the edge of the northern lagoon were dotted with gondola landings where, throughout the 16th century, increasing numbers of immigrants and others traveling from the terra firma disembarked. Although an increasing number of upper-class Venetians established residence in the zone throughout this period, Kanarejo was also home to many industrial trades: boat repair yards, foundries, tanneries, dyeing facilities, soap factories, and the like. These occupations would have been governed by a regular workday schedule that imposed a certain order on the district while leaving it more desolate and perhaps under less surveillance after hours. Among many sites throughout the district, 2 stand out as hubs of the Kanarejo sex trade in the 16th century. One was a node where 2 bridges and 2 canals intersected. The other was a point of convergence for several gondola routes on the waterway from which almost all the district's east-west canals branched. As the examples from the parish of Santa Maria Formosa showed, sex workers often occupied the shadows, small and out-of-the-way courtyards and porticos that offered shelter and anonymity. But they also sought out exposed sites like bridges, where foot and boat traffic converged and the sex worker could display herself while enjoying a good vantage point from which to monitor approaching authorities and potential clients, particularly when, as was often the case during this period, the bridge did not have parapet walls, and even more so in Kanarejo, where the canals and quays were exceptionally long and straight. So a significant node of sex work in Kanarejo was Ponte De La Sayo. This bridge spanned the canal Rio de la Misericordia and connected to a long, straight waterside canal, or waterside quay, rather, and this was known as the Fundamenta De La Misericordia, and the characteristics of this quay were really particular, unlike anything else that we see in Venice. It's a kind of spatial type that we only see in Kanarejo. And this combination of elements formed a compound spatial typology of bridge plus portico plus quay, with nearby steps descending to the canal, marking a stop for the gondola based at the Jewish ghetto to the west. In the late 16th century, the bridge was the epicenter of the neighborhood sex trade. The catalog mentioned earlier places 6 sex workers at the bridge itself and 2 in an adjacent street. All but one of their procurers could be found in the vicinity. Later in the 16th century, the census counts at least 18 sex workers living nearby. As noteworthy as this concentration is, the parish census for this area counted a total number of over 70 sex workers. The trade was dispersed throughout the district, and Ponte De La Sayo was apparently not even its most active location. This distinction belonged to the island that was home to the convent of Santa Caterina and the friary and hospital of the Crociferi, where gondolas connected the city to the northern lagoon islands. Almost half of the 200 sex workers named in the catalog could be found in Kanarejo, and a third of those, 31 sex workers, were associated with this island. An important figure there was a procurer identified as Kate Schiavone, who managed 12 meretrici. 5 of them shared her base of operations near the convent of Santa Caterina, but the others who worked with or for her could be found at various points around Kanarejo, achieving maximum coverage and minimum infringement on individual territory. For solicitation, they favored the squares near churches, which are spaces of hierarchy on most islands, and quays and porticos adjacent to gondola landings. Given the extent of her network, Kate appears to have held a position of relative importance and influence, perhaps even power and status, but she didn't have a monopoly on the sex market near Santa Caterina. 12 meretrici based their work independently, while others collaborated with their mother, their brother, neighbor, or servant. Kate Schiavone also faced competition from gondoliers who acted as procurers. 3 of them worked the landings at Santa Caterina and represented 6 women who solicited there. Another sex worker based on the island was represented by her stepfather, also listed as a gondolier, working across the town at the Rialto landings. Analysis of pedestrian and boat circulation throughout the city reveals important links between sex work and gondola landings and routes elsewhere in Venice, where landings formed part of a complex spatial and infrastructural typology, with piers or steps connecting travelers by boat to squares, quays, porticos, bridges, and streets, serving sex workers in important, if not immediately apparent ways. And gondolas and other boats not only connected to fixed places of solicitation, they sometimes served as mobile sites for trysts, hidden under the fabric covering of the gondola's felze, or cabin, causing authorities to try during the 16th and 17th centuries to restrict sex workers' movements on the city's canals. As discussed earlier, Rialto was a hub for boat traffic, overlapping with sex work networks there. One landing in particular was noted in 1608 by the Englishman Thomas Coriat, who called attention to the gondoliers at the landing known variously as the Buzzo di Rialto, that is the hole of Rialto, or the Traghetto dei Ruffiani, in other words, the ferry of the pimps. Coriat described the gondoliers there as the most vicious and licentious in Venice, quite a claim since boatmen were widely considered to be some of the rowdiest, violent, and uncouth men in the city. And the image on the top of this slide on the left represents that landing of the Buzzo di Rialto just beside the Rialto Bridge. The gondolas at the Buzzo were supposedly sure to lead the unsuspecting foreigner towards seduction, perhaps in collaboration with matrons from the municipal brothel located at the opposite end of Rialto's main thoroughfare from where the Buzzo gondolas landed. Although the Buzzo landing was not designated for night service, other Rialto landings were, connecting to pedestrian routes leading directly toward the brothel and other known sites of transactional sex, including the many porticos in the area. So it's possible that the gondoliers collaborated with procurers after dark, when the brothel's residents were supposed to leave the streets and could not solicit for themselves. Or perhaps they supplied customers to the independent sex workers in the neighborhood. These circumstances introduce a dimension that I haven't yet addressed today, but that is integral to any discussion of the ways in which sex workers moved through and experienced the city, and that is time, specifically nighttime, which determined what people were sanctioned to do, what they actually did, and where and how they did it. Nighttime was marked both naturally by the setting of the sun and mechanically by the ringing of the Realtina, the Rialto bell that signaled the start of curfew 3 hours after sunset. Night carried with it associations of ambiguity, suspicion, anxiety, and threat. The ability to see what and who was ahead, always a challenge when moving through the constricted spaces of Venice's streets and canals, was further diminished, putting all the senses on high alert. Concerns about the dangers of nighttime circulation became clear in 1450 when the city passed a law requiring anyone out after curfew to carry a lantern or a candle. For most in the city, nighttime marked the end of the workday, and it came to be associated not only with leisure, but also with indiscipline and disorder and even diabolical temptations, all of which were also attached to and amplified by the presence of the sex worker. Beginning in the 14th century, the city pursued strategies for controlling the night, instituting magistracies to monitor the streets and the canals, both day and night, but with intensified attention to nighttime activities and increased penalties for crimes committed after curfew. But what did the night mean for the tactical movements of sex workers? In the absence of a system of nocturnal illumination, which didn't arrive in Venice until the 18th century, the urban elements that feature so prominently in the sex trade, gondola landings and bridges, were the best and most reliably lit places in Venice, with the exception perhaps of Piazza San Marco, which at one point was more illuminated than other spaces within the city. The open spaces of the canal and the reflective qualities of the water intensified ambient light from adjacent buildings or passers-by. Gondoliers were required to hang a lantern on the prow of their boat, and landings were marked with a ferrale, like the one you see here in the bottom left. And if, as ordered in 1310, persons did not move between parishes after curfew, the canals that define parish limits and the bridges that span them would have prompted and accommodated different spatial practices from those in evidence during the day, perhaps establishing new patterns of circulation and informing different modes of surveillance and defiance than those seen during the day. Many of these nodes were also lit by oil lamps of street-side tabernacles. I'm going to go back here. You can see one of these tabernacles on the right of this slide. So these tabernacles also provided focal points, albeit relatively dim ones, within an otherwise dark context. Venetians began erecting these neighborhood shrines as early as the 12th century. And in 1450, the city ordered every neighborhood to appoint a layperson to serve as their custodian, while parish priests took charge of their locked alms boxes. As Edward Muir has shown, they were established in part to discourage immoral activities in the public realm, but the relationship to place has until now not been explored. About a third of the nearly 500 tabernacles that survive today date from the 16th century or earlier. This map of their locations in Kanarejo shows that most were not located on the more heavily trafficked pedestrian routes, but rather in out-of-the-way places, streets that dead-end in a courtyard or at a canal, which were more difficult for night watchmen to monitor. Some could be found at the end of a bridge, at intersections where pedestrian and boat circulation connected, and in porticos. Guild statutes for several of the gondola landings show that they also sponsored and maintained such tabernacles, with the boatmen arriving for night shifts responsible for keeping the shrine's lamp lit. It's unlikely that evidence exists to confirm that tabernacles were cited to deter solicitation and other so-called dishonest acts that were already happening in particular locations, but mapping their sites in relation to places of sex work does suggest that this may have been at least one consideration among possible others, providing insights into the ways in which the trade was integrated into neighborhood life. As these case studies show, sex workers were some of the most marginalized individuals in early modern Venice, and yet they were also integrated into their communities and neighborhoods, central to the networks that organized and structured everyday social and commercial life. The encounters, interactions, and relationships of mobile human actors were inflected by the fixed sites where sex workers lived and worked, and in turn, sex workers and their associates contributed to durable perceptions of place. Visualizing the spectrum of their everyday activities offers new and nuanced understanding of urban mobility and its limits, where the built environment could be deployed in the exercise of agency. Thank you.